It is a delight to see all of you here today. A few more show up and we'll have to start selling seats here. It is great to see all of you this morning. All my stuff here. Louise Fletcher was an American poet. She lived in the latter part of the 19th century and all the way through to the whole middle of the 20th century. She died in 1957. In 1921, she was 43 years of age, and even at that age, she had lived something of a tumultuous life. She had been married 3 times and divorced 3 times. One of her husbands was an alcoholic. She had a daughter who, in the daughter's teenage years, passed away. And so, with a life that was that difficult, there were occasions on which she wished that she could sort of start things fresh, anew. And so she penned those familiar lines that go, I wish there were some wonderful place called the land of beginning again, where all our mistakes and all our heartaches and all our poor selfish griefs could be dropped like a shabby old coat at the door and never put on again. I think most of us, if we are honest, would say that there have been times in our lives in which we would like to visit the land of beginning again. Because all of us at one time or another have regrets, disappointments that we would like to put behind us and perhaps start anew and afresh. Once in a while, I hear someone interviewed who says, if I could live my life over again, I wouldn't change a thing. Oh. Are they stupid? 70 or 80 years, and they said they wouldn't change a thing. I can think of a car I bought some years ago that turned out to be something of a limit. And I would buy a different car. I can think on one occasion of taking the night coach from Detroit to New Orleans for the Southern Baptist Convention because it would save me $20 to leave after midnight. Arriving in New Orleans at 3 in the morning. And when we got to our hotel, got to the room, turned the key in the lock and opened the door, someone was already in the bed. You wouldn't change that word.
I wondered who that was.
Confession is good for the soul. Well, I think all of us have those points in our lives when we would like to go to the land of beginning again and experience renewal, start afresh, begin anew. And this morning's lesson is about a community of God's people who are granted the privilege and the unusual privilege of returning to a familiar place and starting over. A little historical context. There are several red letter events that take place in the history of Israel. They are, in many respects, the constitutive events for the Jewish people. Obviously, there was the captivity of the people in Egypt under the rule of the Pharaoh, the somewhat tyrannical rule of the Pharaoh. There was that remarkable moment of the parting of the Red Sea with a strong east wind that delivered the people from bondage into freedom, the Exodus. Then there are those long years of wandering in the wilderness, some 40 years for the people. There was the movement of the people into this new land and the conquest of the land of Canaan. They developed, went from being what was termed as an Amphictyony, just a wandering people, to being a nation where they had a monarchy. And you remember the stories of Saul and David and Solomon as kings of Israel. And then they had come to the point where they were a small nation of God's people living in Judah, in the city of Jerusalem. And as nations come and go, there was a nation to the east called Babylon that rose up in power under King Nebuchadnezzar, and they set siege on Jerusalem. And in 598, BC, they marched the people of Jerusalem away from their homeland to exile in Babylon. Not all of the people were exiled, but many of the people from 598 to 587, during those years, most of the people of Jerusalem were exiled. And there in exile, they stayed for almost 60 years. But as nations come and go, so Babylon went on the descent, the Persians went on the ascent under King Cyrus, and in 539 BC, the Persians took over Babylon. And the very next year, 538 BC, King Cyrus issued an edict, and in that edict, he promised the people of the Jewish people that they could return to their homeland in Jerusalem. And as a part of that edict, he said that they would have the privilege of restoring their temple to its past glory. That's part of the lesson you had a couple of Sundays ago, the rebuilding of the temple. Well, they did return 538, and they did not rebuild their temple. And so God raised prophets Haggai and Zechariah. Klaus Westermann, in his little book, 1,000 Years and a Day, Our Time in the Old Testament, Klaus Westermann calls these prophets of the restoration. And they prophesied the returning of the people, of the Jewish people, to rebuild the temple. And in 520 BC, the next king of the Persians, King Darius, or Darius, whichever way you prefer to pronounce it, issued a second decree. And the second decree ordered that the temple be rebuilt and sacrifices to God resume. And in this instance, he put a little bit of teeth into his order. He reissued the edict of Cyrus, and then he said, I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled upon it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. A little external incentive to the rebuilding of the temple. Well, Cyrus's decree, and then the decree of Darius created a sense of hope and expectation among the Jewish people and these exiles. But very quickly, their hope was turned to disappointment as they found themselves in sort of a sense of wilderness when they returned to their homeland. And you will, I think, appreciate why they began to feel like they were in this wilderness when they returned. Most of the people who had occupied Jerusalem in 598 BC were gone. remember, 60 years they were in exile. If they had been 30 years old when they were exiled, now they would have been 90 years of age when they were allowed to return. So many of them never saw the return. You remember the words of the psalmist, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept. How do we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Then the children of the exiles, the second and the third generation of the exiles, had become acculturated to Babylon. They had sort of become comfortable in living in Babylon. You remember the number of people who came to the United States in the 1970s following the Vietnam War, people from Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. They settled here. One couple who settled here who were basically freed in a refugee camp in Thailand were Samuel and Shamron Nuon. Sam and Shamron became Christians under the influence of Southern Baptist missionaries in this refugee camp in Thailand. And they came to the U.S., where they were sponsored by folks from Derbyshire Baptist Church, our neighboring church. Samuel decided to start a Cambodian congregation where the people who had come would be able to worship in their native language. And I had the privilege later of supervising Sam's D.Min degree, Southeastern Seminary. And Samuel was frustrated ultimately because the second generation Cambodians and the third generation Cambodians, his children and grandchildren, no longer wanted to worship in the Cambodian language. They grew up in the U.S. They were Americans. They went to schools, American schools. English was their first language, not their second language. And that had happened to the second and third generation children of the exiles from Jerusalem. And so when they returned, in many cases, they didn't return. They said, we're not going to. We're going to stay in Babylon. And then when the exiles returned, the people who were currently living in Jerusalem didn't particularly welcome them with open arms because they had occupied those empty dwellings that they left in 598 BC. And moreover, the neighboring nations didn't want them back because they didn't want Judah to be restored to power and become a competition among the nations. So there are a myriad of reasons why the people returning felt like the return was to a time of wilderness. Judah had been a free and an independent political entity, and now it was no longer a free and independent state. They were a colony of the Persian Empire, a remnant community. And historically, if you look at the history of the people of Israel, exile was the point at which the Israeli people became a diaspora scattered across the world. So they discovered themselves in this wilderness. For 20 years after they returned, they were stuck in neutral. They spent their time preoccupied with their personal concerns. Their neighbors, as I said, were opposed to the rebuilding of the temple. They made no progress. But then with the edict of Darius, that became a rallying point. They realized if they had a future at all, it wasn't as a political entity, a nation. They realized if they had a future, it was as a religious entity, a spiritual community, a community of God's people. And the temple would be that visible thing that reconnected them with their past and with their faith. And so it was important then that they began the process of a process of renewal of restoration to being God's people. And they came to understand that God was behind this. There's an old saying, never waste a good crisis. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There are always lessons that we can learn when we find ourselves in the midst of some testing or difficulty. And so when we find ourselves in the midst of that, we look for something or someone who can shake us out of our lethargy, our status quo. And I think in my experience, renewal or personal revival begins with some stimulus, often an external stimulus, or some catalyst, some precipitating event or person who comes into our lives and goads us or challenges us to seek out this sense of renewal. That event can be many things. It can be the marriage or the end of a marriage. It can be the birth of a child or the loss of a loved one. It can be some decisive event like the leaving of a job or the beginning of another job. But there are those things in our lives that lead us to the point of seeking and experiencing renewal in our relationship with God. And what is true for us as individuals, I think is also true for us as religious communities, as a church, or as a group of churches. And that certainly was the experience that the people who came back from exile discovered in 520 BC with the rededication and the rebuilding of the temple. Let me use a sort of a practical experience of my own. 1983, I became pastor at Franklin Baptist Church. Vivian and I were in Michigan as serving there. We left Michigan, we moved to Franklin, where I became pastor of that congregation. And when we arrived, the church had a series of buildings. There were about 4 buildings in all, but the first 2 of those buildings had been built when the church moved to that site in the first decade of the 20th century. So those buildings, when we arrived there, were almost 80 years old. And nothing much had been done to restore and renew those buildings. And so there was a sense among the congregation that we needed to kind of freshen things up with those buildings. They thought a few buckets of paint, maybe a few brighter light bulbs, maybe even a few rolls of carpet would do the trick. So we had somebody make an estimate of that, and that would have been a couple of $100,000. But I began walking through that building along with others, and we began to see that there were a lot of things wrong. The ceilings were about 12 feet high, and you'd go in a room this size, 12-foot ceilings, and one little single light bulb right at the top. Plaster was beginning to paint was peeling, plaster was falling. The floors were heart pine lump. And over those years, that heart pine had begun to warp a little bit, so it was a little uneven. You couldn't turn on lights with the light switch. You had to go to the circuit panel and flip on the lights. And the wiring behind the walls was knob and tube wiring. And finally, all the pipes were asbestos wrapped pipes. And you know, I began to sense that this needed more than just paint and wallpaper and carpet. But at the same time, I was not as worried about the building as I was about the fellowship of the church and the ministries of the church. And so we developed, I think the term now here at River Road is a vitality committee. We developed, in essence, a committee to start looking at the future and what we would do with our ministries and so forth. And they said, who is going to help us with that? And I said, well, when I did my graduate study, PhD work at Southern Seminary, my supervisory professor was a man named Willis Bennett. Bill knew Willis well. And I worked with Willis for 4 years. And I said, I think I'm going to call Willis and see if he'll come over and just spend 24 hours with us and give us a read on our building and ministries. So he agreed to do that. He had a daughter who lived over in the Gloucester area, so he came to visit her and then drove over one day to Franklin. When he got there, I took him on a tour of the community. Any of you who had been through Franklin 40 years ago, one of the most beautiful small towns in Virginia, lovely housing area, and really upscale for a small town in southeastern Virginia. Then I took him back to the church and we took a little tour of the buildings and so forth. And talked about our ministries in the future. That evening we had a dinner for all the people on the committee. We sat sitting around the table and did all the proverbial small talk. And the time came for Willis to sort of give us an assessment. And he said, I'm delighted to be here today. Had a great visit with the community and with the church. And he said, I think what I probably ought to begin with is to say that if I and my family moved to Franklin, Virginia, the first place we would visit is Franklin Baptist Church. He said, we're Baptists, and this is the tall steeple in downtown Franklin. This is the first place we visit. And then he paused, and he said, and the next Sunday we would go somewhere else and probably join some other church. And it's like somebody had put a fan, blew the hair of me. And they were shocked. They were aghast. And one man on the committee, very angry and incensed, and he started going after Willis. And, how dare you come in our town, our beautiful town, and do this, and our lovely church, and so forth. And Willis said, well, let me finish. He said, it's very simple. I drove around your lovely town. It is beautiful. You take great care of your town, but you don't take very good care of God's house. You take better care of your houses and your property than you do of God's house. Well, that was pretty stark. And, the meeting didn't end well, let's put it that way. But when I gathered that group together after Willis left, a couple of days later, the people who were the most upset said, he's right. And we need to do something. And so they set out on a 4-year project of completely redoing that property. Tore down one old building, replaced it with a state-of-the-art area with an elevator, linked up the other buildings, gutted 2 other buildings, and redid all of the inside, and raised over $2 million, which was a lot of money. And it's a lot of money today, but I mean, it was a whole lot of money 4 years ago. And that really recharged, revitalized, renewed the life of that congregation. Well, the point I'm making is that when we find ourselves in some situation in life where we need to experience renewal, often it is some stimulating, catalytic kind of experience that leads us to the point where we need to experience renewal. And that is precisely what this edict by both Cyrus and Darius did for the people in the rebuilding of the temple. And there's the lovely Now I finally offended Bert.
Not me, not me.
But not Paul, okay.
I love it.
And our lesson says, then according to the word sent by Darius the king, their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered, and the elders of the Jews built and prospered. Through the prophesying of Haggai and the prophet of Zechariah, they finished their building by the command of God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And this house was finished on the third day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. And then this verse tells us what they did when they felt this renewal. And the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. And so I guess that my final talking point then is that renewal, be it individual renewal, congregational renewal, community renewal, generates in us a sense of great joy. And we appropriately celebrate that kind of renewal when we experience it. So Israel then was in that day restored to being a worshiping community, a remnant of God's people there in Jerusalem. Now, we do know the rest of the story, don't we? And the rest of the story is not a completely happy story. This season of joy and renewal did not last longer than a generation or two. And sometimes the reason we need periodic renewal in our lives is because renewal only lasts for a certain amount of time. And we should welcome renewal, not find it unwelcome. Over the next 60 years, this is what happened to the religious community of Israel. The worship in the temple took on an institutional character. It became rote and somewhat indifferent. Participation in worship was limited to the clergy. It was a religious show put on by the professionals. The sacrifices, so central to the worship of God's people, became mechanistic. The priests were organized into a hierarchy with a high priest and lower priests, and the high priest jockeyed for political position and power, and the practice of faith that was so essential to God's people became superficial. And the hopes that had been lifted by one generation, in one generation, faded in the next generation or two, meaning that they needed to be renewed once again. And so there is this cycle of renewal and decline that takes place, this ebb and flow, not only of the work of God's people, but of our lives individually. We need to be sensitive to that ebb and flow spiritually in our own lives and welcome the kind of renewal that can come at the hand of God. And that really brings us to next week's lesson, because that will then sort of finish up that story of Ezra. It's a book that we don't look at very much, but it's a very interesting book. And it always reminds us of lessons. So important to our faith. So thank you all for your attention today.
Good.